Today's webinar is on accelerating your continuous delivery with Jenkins and ReadyAPI. Today with us are myself, Dan Giordano, I'm product marketing manager for the ReadyAPI test suite, Stephen Colon, solutions engineer, and Mike Hawley, a solutions engineer as well, both focused on the ReadyAPI suite and the Swagger API suites we have at SmartBear. Just a little housekeeping real quick. This class is being recorded, and please be sure to add your questions to the Q&A box. The chat gets a little squirrely, so please be sure to keep them in the Q&A box. We'll get to those at the end of today's webinar. So after the demo, we'll go through and be sure to answer those all for you. If we can't get to them because of time, we'll be sure to go through all the questions and get back some personal answers for you. And third off, we also have some surveys today. So please participate in the survey. We'll be doing one right after this quick intro. All right, SmartBear. So who are we? We're a Boston-based company with 7 offices globally that focus on creating solutions for developer, testing, and operations teams to help them instill quality throughout the entire software development lifecycle. We were founded in 2009 and continue to add products to our portfolio, including the popular open source tools like SoapUI and Swagger, and our newest additions to the club, cross-browser testing and HipTest, Agile testing platform. And their recent purchases from just, I think HipTest was about 2-3 months ago at this point. So really new, and we have some awesome things going on here. So here's our entire tool set. I'll breeze through this real quick. We have tools ranging from development, test, and operations, again, across multiple layers. So UI and the API layer. We'll be talking mostly about the API layer today. So we have Swagger Hub here on the left, helping us design and develop and document those APIs. SoapUI Pro, functional testing tool. Service vPro, or service virtualization solution, and then LoadUI Pro, our load testing tool on the API side. We'll also be maybe talking a little bit about AlertSite today and monitoring those APIs, but that's really our full gamut that we'll be talking about today. Just a brief interruption to bring you the news of our second SmartBear user conference. You can find more at the address listed, smartbear.com/connect-2018. This was an amazing experience last year. We had guest speakers and different customers sharing their years of testing knowledge and SmartBear experience. This year will be right downtown in Boston, so you won't want to miss it. You can get tickets now at the URL listed there. All right, today's agenda. We'll be going through the poll right after this, actually, which is a good poll for you guys today. Then we have an overview of continuous integration, continuous deployment. We'll be talking about a little bit about test automation's importance in all of this, API testing, kind of where that fits in as well. And then we'll actually be going through a nice long demo of Jenkins and the ReadyAPI suite. All right, so actually before I do that, let me start this poll real quick. All right, so you should see the poll up on your screen now. First question is your team currently utilizing a CICD pipeline? And then the second question is, which CICD pipeline are you most familiar with? Which one is your team mostly using at this point? We'll just give that a couple seconds now for everyone to answer up. All right, so definitely a majority of you are familiar and utilizing a CI/CD pipeline right now. And then Jenkins definitely seems to be the overall winner there for commonality. I'll end this polling now. We got 75%. Thank you, everyone. Display these results. Give you guys a second to take that in. But yes, 69%, 32% no. Which CI/CD pipeline? Definitely overwhelmingly Jenkins. What do we have next? Other, and then maybe Bamboo. All right, that seems, okay, not familiar as well. That seems pretty normal. All right, so now let's stop sharing those. Get that off your screen, and let's begin. All right, we'll start with what is CI/CD? And CI/CD is a process of continuously integrating and deploying new code into an existing database. They're usually set in conjunction, but we've actually found that it's pretty often that this happens. Like we'll go through the kind of the differences between the two, but they're also often used together. But CI, continuous integration, actually just talks about integrating the code into a master branch, and doesn't really deal with deploying any of the code onto production. Continuous deployment is that. It's the process of actually deploying that code to production in an automated fashion. And I think this slide talks a little bit better to that. So continuous integration does not at all deal with actually delivering the application to prod. It only deals with getting new code into the master branch of a repository early and often. When that code is pushed, the application or service is packaged up, built, tested, and then deployed on the test server. Your entire testing suite, as we'll talk about, should be run when that code is integrated, from unit test to API test to end-to-end test. But the end customer might not see any of those changes. They'll just be sitting on your repository in GitHub. Continuous delivery is kind of the first level of actually getting that product into the user's hands. So we're actually deploying the branch to production, but it's happening in a manual action. So there's either a manual button that you're clicking to deploy, or there's a manual check on the process, but there's a manual action going to production. And then continuous deployment is a combination of all of this. So we're integrating our code in often, we're testing it, we're deploying to that test server, but now we're actually also deploying to our production server all in an automated fashion. So as soon as I write my code and I go into my terminal and git commit, and leave a nice detailed message, of course, for our GitHub, Jenkins starts the entire process. If all the tests pass, the new master branch replaces the current one on the production server. So there's no real human interaction going on after that first code is committed. And CI/CD is perfect for Agile methodology. Agile isn't so much a deployment methodology, but a process. But this continuous process is absolutely perfect for the iterative manner of CI/CD. In fact, I think some would say it might require and necessitate it. They really go hand in hand in this way. Agile's call to rapidly iterate and get feedback early and often is perfectly complemented by a strong CI/CD pipeline with sufficient automated test coverage to get you as much feedback back to the development team as quickly as possible. Regression tests at multiple layers of the product are also really important, and they can be a huge time saver when deploying code, as it'll make sure the core functionality of the current working version of our application, our new code didn't break that. And if it did, we'll just simply roll back. But it's perfect for quick changes and quickly getting new features into the market. Agile kind of has the same objectives of continuous integration and delivery. We're all trying to iterate often, get as much new feature and content out into the public, and get feedback as quickly as we possibly can. So why is test automation needed in all of this? The word continuous, I think, gives you some idea of speed, right? Continuous sounds a little bit fast, so it shouldn't be super slow. But CI/CD does not solve really at all the challenge of time taken during the testing phase. So if your testing is still largely done by manual work, then CI/CD will largely be wasted. And the benefits of moving quickly actually won't be felt. QA teams will feel overworked because they'll constantly be getting new code pushed to them, but they'll still feel the burden of being a bottleneck in that spot. They won't be able to move quickly enough to actually deploy that code that's trying to get integrated into the branch. By automating our tests, we can cut our testing time down and be able to reasonably integrate code with full testing coverage into the application. So that word continuous starts to actually feel fast and maybe continuous. So maybe at first our build time is an hour after actually getting automated testing up and running, which sounds pretty good. A process that maybe took days or weeks, we're now having up in a pipeline, being able to run with automated tests, taking 60 minutes. That sounds awesome. But now if we can combine that with great unit test coverage, great API testing coverage, and running UI tests in parallel in maybe a cloud like cross-browser testing, we can cut that time down to minutes. So as soon as we actually commit that code to our Git instance, we're getting fast feedback across our entire testing suite in only a few minutes, which can tremendously transform the way that software teams are actually deploying the software. So here's just a quick rundown again of some of these benefits of automation. We're going to get faster development cycles. We're going to reduce that time that we looked at before that's in between committing the code and actually deploying. We'll be able to drastically reduce that testing time. We'll also be able to increase test coverage just by the nature of having automated testing. We can drive data through them. We can also just in general test more browsers and increase that coverage. And then there's the faster time to resolution. Once you're getting instant feedback, you'll actually be able to locate where bugs are happening and not having to deal with an entire application that you just basically revamped in a 3-month, let's call it a 3-month sprint. You're now doing such in a day, so you have a manageable code base going into your existing code, and you can fix those bugs when they do happen quickly. So now that we've kind of covered continuous integration, continuous deployment, let's dive into the kind of the star of the show, Jenkins. So what is Jenkins? Jenkins is an open source CI platform for automating tasks in the deployment pipeline. Jenkins actually used to be called Hudson. It was conceived inside the walls of Sun back in 2003, I believe. And it grew out of Sun into the open source community and just took off. It became wildly popular late in the 2000s. And then Oracle bought Sun. When Oracle bought Sun, they got into a nice fight with the open source community about who actually owned this project of Hudson. They went to court over it. Oracle basically said, well, we'll take Hudson. We want the proprietary name. We want all the actual repository for it. And you can have a fork of it. Well, that fork is now known as Jenkins. It's one of the most popular pieces of software used across all industries, across all types of organizations, sizes of organizations. And Hudson has, I think, 5 stars on GitHub. So you can see the open source battle won, and Jenkins has proved to be a really robust, popular tool. It's wildly popular in part because of its open source nature, and just the community is tremendous, but also the fact that it's more of a framework that's built on plugins. So it has thousands of plugins in a kind of marketplace ecosystem, and they make integrating different types of tools at different parts of your pipeline real easily, as we'll see when we install our own Jenkins plugin. Just a quick note on other CI tools too. Jenkins certainly is not the only fish in the sea. There are other CI platforms. Some deliver their offerings in the cloud only. Some deliver only on-prem. And some are open source, some are paid. You can see here we have CodeShip, TeamCity, Circle CI, Go, Bamboo, and Travis. These are just a few examples. We saw before Jenkins drastically owns the market though. Jenkins projects. This is how Jenkins kind of organizes itself. They're pre-built templates to get up and running quickly. The freestyle project is kind of how the entire tool was built around, and it's probably the most commonly used. But there are some pipelines, Maven project templates, and different folders that you can get up and running quicker than just starting from a freestyle project. Next, we have Blue Ocean versus Classic. Blue Ocean is new Jenkins UI. It came out in the spring of 2017. It's actually a plugin, and it's Jenkins revamped, rethought work on their UI itself. The UI UX is drastically different. We have a visual pipeline editor. The editor does lack some of the flexibility of the old Classic configuration, but it is great to actually visualize and see reporting of your pipeline as it goes through. And like I said, I honestly edit usually the pipeline in the Classic. It's a little bit more configurable, but once you're done configuring it, you can look at the pipeline itself in Blue Ocean. Here's a closer example of Blue Ocean with some of the ready API products in here. So we have our start and our build phase. And then we're going to go into our functional testing. We're going to be maybe testing a shopping cart endpoint. Then we have load UI. We have performance testing in that same pipeline. And then security testing with SoapUI Pro. And then you can actually virtualize all that and maybe deploy to a different team or get up and running quickly. But you can see it's a really good visualization of actually what's going on while our application is going through the pipeline. We have a little, it's actually more of a view from 5,000 feet, but this is in general what a CI pipeline looks like. Here in this instance, we might be working on an API in Swagger Hub. Swagger Hub is our API design and documentation portal. We're working on the API spec there. Once we save it, we might commit that to GitHub. And from there, Jenkins is going to take over. So Jenkins is listening for GitHub to actually get an update. Once that happens, it's going to pull in that new source code. It's going to run some unit tests, maybe some static analysis tests against the actual code itself. Then it's going to start packaging up the application. In this instance, we're going to deploy just the API layer in a microservice. And then we're going to be able to run our API tests against that. Why do we do that? We do that really for speed. If something fails in our API layer, which should have maybe the best testing coverage out of all the layers, we'll be able to see that quicker. We won't go through the entire pain of building the entire application out, running end-to-end tests. We'll just simply get feedback back to the developers. We'll make changes and go from there. So it's great to kind of deploy in these layers so you're getting fast feedback back to your development team. Once we do get through the API checks though and everything is green, we'll actually build our full application here, maybe on Amazon, maybe on Azure or Heroku. But that UI will get built out and we'll be able to run tests against it with UI tools like Test Complete, Selenium, Test Left. But that's when the actual end-to-end tests come into play. And then if those pass, Jenkins will actually throw that code into production and we'll be running. That new code can be then monitored with Alert Site. So here's kind of a full CI/CD pipeline and what's happening at each step. Some Jenkins best practices. Certainly one is to use a source control management tool. This is kind of best practice for really anything that deals with programming. But Jenkins and Git work together really well. There's also the GitHub auto status plugin, which is really awesome for reporting back into GitHub. It'll just give you some stats about build times so you can track things like that. Also use parallel builds. So Jenkins has the ability to run multiple builds at one time. That'll help you get through your testing a lot quicker. Also run unit tests as part of your pipeline. This is something that a lot of teams actually leave to the development stage before your code is actually integrated. So they'll manually run those unit tests and then feel comfortable enough to actually put the code in the pipeline. But we actually recommend putting that unit test library as part of your pipeline. And then, of course, try to provide realistic testing environments. We have to remember that Jenkins is still a kind of a test server. It's not a real production environment. We might have virtualized assets. We might have dependencies that we're relying on, but make sure to provide the most accurate production-like environment for our tests and our staging. And that, I believe, will lead us now to our demo. So I think I'll kick it over to the team now. All right. Let me stop sharing. All right, you guys can share. I'll let you know when I can see. Perfect. Awesome. See some ReadyAPI.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so now let's go ahead and start talking about actually implementing this Jenkins pipeline that we saw and implementing some of the best practices we saw. So before we dive deep into our pipeline, let's talk about ReadyAPI as a product and how we can set up a API project, API testing project, to then feed into something like Jenkins. So before we even do that, let's talk about ReadyAPI as an overall platform. So for anyone who's not familiar or maybe come from our open source SoapUI tool, SoapUI Pro is actually brought into the ReadyAPI platform. So where we'll be focusing today is SoapUI Pro, where we have our API tests. In this product, we can end-to-end functionally test our API, doing things like data driving against an external data set like a database, passing data dynamically between two API calls, two or more API calls, and really build out a complex workflow for my API test to make sure it's covered and functioning properly. So that's where we're going to focus today and where we're going to dig a little deeper in. Other than that, we have Secure Pro, which is our security testing product for APIs. With Secure Pro, you can reuse the endpoints that you were testing against in SoapUI Pro to start executing security scans against them. We offer security scans like a SQL injection scan or a fuzzing scan so that you can get a really good look into if your API returns any sensitive information and if your API it may do anything else that is not secure for your service. Secure Pro can also let you look at your historical data of your security tests and compare two security tests against each other and generate reports. So it's a very useful first look into your security testing. Just as a sort of disclaimer, Secure Pro is very good for a kicking off security scans from your API endpoints. It's not necessarily meant to replace any security suites you may have currently. So it's a really good first look into security testing and very simple way to just kick off security tests. Our next product is LoadUI Pro, going to the right here. And with LoadUI Pro, we can load test API calls. And even better, we can reuse our functional test cases that we've created in SoapUI Pro. With 3 clicks, start generating load tests against them. So we'll really get this reuse of assets where we don't have to worry about redoing the work or making sure the work is exactly the same between SoapUI Pro and LoadUI. Once we start kicking off our load tests, we can configure patterns of concurrent users, which we call virtual users, in what's called a load profile. So I can do something very simple, like 10 virtual users for 30 seconds, or do a more complex load test where for 8 hours, I'll have 1,000 virtual users and I'll have more of a ramping sequence where it'll ebb and flow between 500 virtual users and 1,000 for the 8-hour load test. And this is all done within a UI without any scripting. Then I can go into LoadUI Pro and set up my statistics, either in table or graph format, so that I can really look at the information in the view that I want to see it in. So doesn't matter what your requirements are, you can represent that in LoadUI Pro. And then you can also distribute your load testing. So in the example I said, 1,000 virtual users is a lot to put on a single machine. So with LoadUI Pro, you can, for no extra charge, you can have an unlimited number of what's called agents. And these are just separate machines either in your company or in the cloud that you can distribute the load to, so that when I run 1,000 virtual users, I'm actually using resources from several different machines as opposed to just my small Windows laptop. So that's LoadUI Pro and something very interesting that we offer within ReadyAPI. Now, the last product that we have here, but certainly not the least, is Service V Pro. This is our service virtualization product. Service V Pro isn't necessarily for testing only, but it's a very useful thing to have within one suite like ReadyAPI. With Service V, we can take any services that may appear as a bottleneck to our testing processes, maybe or any other internal processes we have at our company, and virtualize it. So I can take something like a Google Maps third-party API or an internal API hosted by another development team. And if that API goes down for maintenance too often, if it isn't complete, so I don't have enough to test against, in Service V, we can do things like routing and recording live API traffic to create a localized version of it that we call a vert. And once you sort of build out this vert, you can then either test it locally or deploy it into a server hub, which we call Vert Server. So sort of a unnamed fifth product of ReadyAPI that works with Service V is Vert Server, where you can take your locally created vert, bring it into a server hub, and now have multiple people in your company using this virtualized asset. So it's very useful for speeding up your time to testing. If your development team is not giving you the implemented API they said. You can just virtualize it, create it yourself, and have that created so that you can start testing quicker. Sort of what Dan was speaking to in the automated pipeline with that, deploying the service as a microservice for the automated pipeline. Now, for each product that I've shown here, we have command line tools that lead into automation. So we're focusing on SoapUI Pro and the test runner tool, which I'll talk more about. But for secure, load, and service V, we have command line tools that let you administer security or load tests or deploy verts into the vert server, all in an automated fashion. So you can take what we saw here today, and if you're using any of those other products, you can take it a step further and think about implementing those within your pipelines as well, sort of how we saw with the deeper look. So let's go ahead and look into SoapUI Pro and actually look at the test case that we're going to start working with, and Mike will talk more about in the automated pipeline. Let's look at it in ReadyAPI. So just a little context, this is an open weather map API that accepts an address and just returns weather information about that, whatever's connected to that address. Now, I have this project. It has a very basic, or it just has a single request that will take, the API call, send it out, get a response back, and then it has some validation against it. Now, before we think about putting it into a pipeline, we have to think about where this project will be stored. And with ReadyAPI, we have a Git plugin so that you can host it on any centralized Git repository that's available. Now, this can be GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket. It's really just using Git. Whatever your provider is, you can use that. So to get this hosted up into Git, one of the first things you need to be aware of is whether or not this project is a composite project. So if we look down to the bottom left, we can see that it says composite project and it says, true or false. Now, what a composite project does is instead of storing a project in a single flat XML file, we actually take all of the test suites and test cases, and if you have any security load tests or verts, we take those as well, and bring it into a directory structure so that when we start hosting it with Git, as people start using it, we may get merge conflicts. We can look at that a lot easier if it's a directory structure as opposed to one gigantic flat XML file. So that's really the purpose of taking this composite project structure and using it to then host this into a Git repository. So now once I have it set up as a composite project, all I need to do is then click on the project and look and save and share it. So this is where I'm actually committing to put it into a Git repository. And then once I do that, you'll be opened up with a menu that'll let you do a lot of different actions for this Git integration. You can commit the changes, you can update the changes. In our most recent version, we've added branching support. So now you can actually have 10 different people splitting up between these branches that may represent different parts of your testing and workflow, and then bring it all back into the master. And now that we have it up in a Git repository, what we're going to see is that we can pull it down into a build server like Jenkins that has Jenkins to then start testing against, but also make sure that we have the most updated workflow. So this is where this really falls into automating this pipeline so that, as multiple people are working on it, it's pushed into one central repository. So with that, we have, our repository that's brought into Git, and within our automation, as I was alluding to, there is a command line runner behind SoapUI Pro that you can then take this project and start running within a command line. Now that command line runner has over 20 different arguments, I believe, and it's very extensive to read the documentation and figure out exactly what you want to do. So just as something to look at to make this easier, within ReadyAPI, you can use our launch test runner utility, which will let you in a UI see the different arguments that are available. I can select things like what test suite I want to run. I can override which environment I want to use here, what reports I want to generate. And then using our get command line button, just look at the command line to see what that command line is. So when I start thinking about bringing it into Jenkins, I can just copy this to the clipboard. If it's not on the same machine, I'll have to make sure the path of the test runner tool and the path of the project are updated. But other than that, all of the arguments are created for me. A lot of the work is already done. And now I can start just automating it and, setting a Jenkins job to run however I need it to run over the weekend, whatever that may be. So this is just really the final step to then going into Jenkins and how we can now take ourselves out of ReadyAPI. We built out our tests. We know what our testing is going to look like. And now let's start looking at Jenkins. So I'll turn it over to Mike and we can start looking at that process.
All right. Thanks very much, Steve. Excellent, excellent work. So now that we've taken a look at ReadyAPI, how we can get started with API testing and how we can start managing not only the tests themselves, but how we can hook these into a automated pipeline. So let's hop into Jenkins. Here we go. And there are a few different ways that we can get started using Jenkins, implementing Jenkins. So I'm going to start with Blue Ocean. It's going to give us a nice look into how we can go from the initial design phase into development with GitHub, and then we'll have Jenkins automate monitoring that repository for changes, push pull requests, commits, and then create a really just start building, testing, and then finally deploying it in a various environment here. All right, so the first thing we're going to be taking a look at is what this API looks like. And the easiest way to show off an API is with documentation and with a standardized Swagger definition, a descriptor of the API itself. This descriptor is using Swagger Hub, and Dan touched upon this earlier. So this is a repository for these API definitions. It allows us to manage everything under one roof, be able to edit, be able to create documentation, be able to collaborate and create governance on these APIs. And one of the really cool parts about Swagger Hub is not only being able to design and really establish the best version of the API before it gets coded, we also have the ability to create these syncs, create this automated push as we make changes to the API from Swagger Hub to GitHub, and really start to manage the code that is created from this API and stub things out. All right, so the way we do that within Swagger Hub is with this GitHub Sync integration here. And I'll just, there we go. So you need to connect directly to your GitHub account using OAuth 2. You can specify the owner, the repository, and what you want to be pushing to. This is going to be pushing on save. And we have a lot of these different options to not only push the definition itself, but also the client and server stub. And we have a number of these options here using the most common languages that the industry is using today. So you're able to create Node.js servers, Go servers, Rails, .ASP.NET cores, right? A lot of these different options for your developers and for clients to be able to start spinning up these APIs and start integrating them. All right, so what we're going to be showing off is I'm going to make a change. I'm going to add some exclamation points because it's always good to be excited about development.
Yeah, emphasis.
Yeah, so we'll save this. This save is going to be pushed to GitHub, and it might take a couple seconds here, so I'll refresh the page, right? And we can see that push was created to the Swagger Hub branch, just like the integration said it would. All right. And then in our final stage here, and we can already see this starting to happen. So we're pushing to our Swagger Hub branch. We've got a build here in Jenkins Blue Ocean. And let's actually go into this and take a look at how this is being set up within the pipeline. One more, shell script. All right, so it seems like there's a little bit of an issue. Let's go back here. There we go. All right, so we're already finished building this. We're going to be testing this using the same command line tool that Stephen showed off earlier from ReadyAPI. This is brought over into a Jenkins file to actually execute the test scripts that was created within ReadyAPI. So we're going to be able to see the results of that. And if these tests pass, we're going to move right to the build, be able to stand this up, do that npm start, and then we'll even have a localized version of this application to be able to see those changes. So we're currently installing here, starting the index, and then we'll look at the documentation. So this is a really powerful way of being able to go from the initial design, make changes, push to a repository, manage the code base, be able to really go from that initial design to development. And then using Jenkins, we're able to see the changes made throughout the development process, new integrations, branches being merged, new features being added, and we want to be able to do a full regression suite of tests here. So we make those regression tests in ReadyAPI and SoapUI specifically, and then we use Jenkins to build, test, and deploy. All right. Now, this is a pretty involved process. It took us a little while to get this started. If you're just going to be using ReadyAPI, just using SoapUI for maybe nightly builds, doing some smoke tests against your repository, there's a little bit of an easier way to get that started, right? Maybe you still want to be managing the repository, notifying those changes here, but we've developed just recently within our latest release of ReadyAPI 2.4, a native Jenkins plugin that you can get from the marketplace and just navigate to where your installation is for ReadyAPI, what project you want to be running, test suite, test case. And that's really all you need to get started. So this is the easiest way to go from your initial creation of those ReadyAPI test suites, install the plugin in Jenkins, and then just hit go. All right, so we'll save that. We'll run our project here, and we'll see how that is being built. All right, so this is a really quick process here, so keep your eyes peeled. We can even take a look at everything through the command line. All right, everything's getting picked up. The report was, the project was called, we ran all the tests, and we even reported on the results here, all through that native Jenkins plugin. All right, so using Jenkins, we have a really great ability of going really from the beginning to the end of that deployment phase, whether you're starting with the initial design within Swagger Hub, you want to be able to manage your project here within GitHub, and use Jenkins to tie everything together, monitor those repositories, and be able to build, test, and deploy your application. Right. So now that we're able to go from that initial creation to just about ready to deploy to the production environment, Steve is going to take us through what we can do after we're ready to deploy. So everything's working functionally correct. It scales well within a test environment, and we're ready to take it to the next level to deploy to the rest of the world.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike, for taking us through that. So yeah, as you saw, we really took that test I was showing you and just put it into a pipeline, and we can just start building and deploying things. And one of the concerns that then come up as a logical next step is I have my API, it's tested, it's built. Now it's actually being used by customers. What do I do now? So at the very end of that deep look that we saw in the PowerPoint is then monitoring that API to make sure that as customers interact with it, they're seeing the same functional correctness that we saw within our Jenkins pipeline. And that's where the last product that we're going to talk about in our SmartBear portfolio really fits in AlertSite. So with AlertSite, it's a synthetic monitoring solution that will take your API calls and then actively monitor it synthetically, meaning that before your customers see any issue, AlertSite will constantly check and ping that API so that if an issue comes up, AlertSite will see it first and then alert you about it. So we can see here, I took the Open Weather API, I took that endpoint that we were using, I put it into a monitor so that now over, I stood this up, I think yesterday, every hour, it's sort of rotating through the different AlertSite locations we have, pinging this API and always letting me know that it's all clear. So it's just a good final step to make sure that now that our customers are using it, it's working as we saw in our pipeline. AlertSite can also take SoapUI tests directly. It can take the endpoint as I saw here, and it can also take Swagger files directly. So you can take that Swagger specification you were writing in Swagger Hub and import that directly, and it'll check against the operations that are there. So quite a few options, and it really caps off, automating, making sure our API works, but also it continues to work because as we know, things need to be maintained, things can degrade, any number of things can happen to an API, especially in such a API-focused microservices architecture that we see today. So that's really the end of our demonstration here, capping off with the end and AlertSite. And we've seen a lot of different products. We've talked about ReadyAPI. You may be aware of SoapUI, but not aware of something like LoadUI. We talked about Swagger Hub, which you may or may not have seen, and then also AlertSite. And I want to make sure that everyone that's on this webinar knows that we have a lot of resources so that you can learn more. So you can go onto our website, look up documentation for any of these products, look at pre-recorded webinars that we have, as well as come to some of our new webinars. You can, we're hosting these very often for these different products. You can come on, ask questions live, and really learn more. So this was just, just making sure you guys aren't left in the deep end here, because we did show a lot. But overall, tying it together with Jenkins.
Yeah, and there's actually, one of the questions was about a tutorial. There's a tutorial on SmartBear's blog right now. It's in the testing and monitoring section. It just went up, so it should be on that front page. But it's getting started with Jenkins and ReadyAPI. So you can definitely check that out to give you a little bit of background from what we went over today. We'll send this out as well. Should be on Monday, so you guys will have a recording. You can walk through it all. Michael and Steven, thank you so much. Let's go through some questions now, though. I think there's some awesome questions in here.
Great.
That some people are asking. We start off with, there's actually a quick microservice question. How do we test a single microservice without the dependency of another microservice? It's not super related, but we do have the perfect tool there in Service V Pro that can really help us out.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, Service V Pro is where you can really take those dependencies, you virtualize it to make sure it works correctly. And then now you're just testing that microservice on its own. You're not worrying about this dependency that it may have that may go down for any reason and break everything else. You've virtualized it, you've made it make sure that it stands up and it stays up without, especially worrying about this other company that is maintaining this dependency. So,
all right, there's some couple questions about plugins for Jenkins. I think we got to that, but yeah, so we have a Jenkins plugin, but you certainly don't need the Jenkins plugin to run. You can run from a command line. If you're more familiar with that, feel free to do that. But we also do have the plugin now. A couple of licensing questions about all the different products. You guys want to take that one?
Sure thing. So what we saw in terms of the different products, and let's just open up ReadyAPI here.
Yeah, I think it was more pertaining to ReadyAPI. So.
Sure.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here in terms of the different products, so currently SoapUI Pro and Secure Pro is bundled under the SoapUI license. So you can actually, for no extra charge, if you buy SoapUI Pro, start kicking off security tests and really look at your API security. Then we have LoadUI Pro as its own license. And then we have Service V Pro as a separate license, along with Vert Server if you're looking to then stand it up on a separate hub. So overall, 4 different licenses. The models are a little different between each license depending on what it is.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. So generally, we have two models. The fixed license, which is going to be one seat, one user on a single machine, which is very straightforward. You install it, you install the license, and it's good for the time. We also have a floating license model. This is going to give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of the actual users. So you have a centralized server that contains the licenses. And then if anyone wants to have access to SoapUI, to LoadUI, to service fee, they can check out the license for the time that they require and then check it back in, kind of like a library book. And not only does that allow for more concurrency for different users, each user, no matter who they are on the team, are able to check these out concurrently, as long as there are that many licenses. But this is also the model that allows us to have a lot more flexibility with testing, where we're testing, how we're testing, right? So we see a lot of these containerized or these sort of automatic machines that are building and testing these services, and you can do that on the fly using a floating license.
Yeah.
Yep, and then Test Runner comes with all of that as well. So Test Runner isn't separate. Test Runner is built in to the ReadyAPI platform, so you'll get that.
Correct.
A couple feature questions, actually. One of them is how to take a functional test to a load test. You'll walk through that real quick because it's literally a couple clicks. And then we also have a test coverage question, just how we can easily report on test coverage if there's anything in SoapUI that can handle that.
Sure, absolutely. So let's start with the first one here, going from SoapUI to LoadUI. So the idea being is that once you determine that your application, your APIs are working as intended, right? Everything's in the green light. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll still be able to handle the stress of a production or production-like environment. So we want to be able to see how our application scales. And all we need to do, right-click, create new load test, hit OK.
I love those 3 clicks.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yep.
So as we speak, it's bringing the functionality over from SoapUI to LoadUI. The request is there. If you had a series of requests, all the context is there, the data-driven functionality, passing values from responses to new requests, that's all brought into LoadUI. And we can even hit run now and start load testing this API without any additional configuration.
Yep. And again, if you want to learn more about load testing, we have a lot of documentation and even pre-recorded webinars. We did a webinar recently, one of our colleagues did, where he showed fully going from SoapUI to LoadUI and then talked more about LoadUI Pro and how you can start load testing. So,
yeah, that was about 20 minutes, very digestible if you're on a lunch break.
Yeah, exactly. So I recommend looking at that so you can dig in a lot deeper. But as you saw, 3 clicks. What was the other question about?
Test coverage.
Test coverage, yes. Okay. So we can show that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's most effective when you're using a definition file. You want to be able to see what operations are available to you, what you expect for those inputs and those outputs. And once you have that determined, whether it's from a Swagger definition or maybe you have something a little bit more legacy like a WSDL, you can go over to the coverage option here, enable that, and then run your tests, and we'll be able to see how well this contract is covered here. So it seems like not very well, considering we didn't have a definition to start off or use as a comparison.
No.
All right, we have, is there a sample application to practice today's session on? So we're actually working on that right now. We should be done soon, but for the Open Weather API is open. You can sign up for a free access token and get set up and running. I think it's like 20,000 calls a month. Certainly to experiment, you can get up and running.
Yeah.
You can also use the pet store endpoint provided by Swagger as well. So petstore.swagger.io. Always feel free to hit that and have that as part of your test. We have a question. Currently using ReadyAPI and Bamboo. I'm trying to automate. There is no plugin. Getting a little errors. Can you talk a little bit about that? we work with Bamboo. It's on-prem. That would be my only thing right off the bat, is make sure that your ReadyAPI license and everything is installed on the same machine as the Bamboo server itself.
Yeah.
But it should work in the same way, where you're taking that command line and putting it into a build step in Bamboo.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, but one of the main things I've seen is if it's a separate build server, meaning a separate machine, you should make sure that there's a license activated, you know, depending on whether it's a model like a floating that just checks it automatically, or a fixed license if it's a static machine. So that's one of the main issues I've seen when people are going to a separate build server. Other than that, you know, feel free to submit a support case. We have a, you know, support team here who can help you through that, look at what error you're seeing and help you out there.
Yeah, and maybe I actually did just get ReadyAPI set up in a Bamboo pipeline, so maybe I'll do a tutorial.
Nice.
Put that out so we can follow along.
Yeah.
Do you have any guidelines on executing performance tests in the CI pipeline? Can you guys speak a little bit to that? Or at least you should do it. Yeah. It's definitely something that's not that common, right? Like,
no, it's not as common.
In your normal CI/CD pipeline, we see less customers using load performance testing in that pipeline. It's something that's growing fast, right?
Yes.
Performance testing is becoming more important, and we're seeing the CI/CD pipeline actually getting worked into it, and not just maybe something you run on a weekly basis or monthly basis, but something that's done all the time. Something that actually helps out with that load testing in the CI/CD pipeline is virtualizing some of your assets.
Yep.
So load testing, by definition, sometimes gets expensive if those dependencies cost. So let's say we're putting our application that, let's say an e-commerce application through our pipeline, and every time we commit, which is several times a day, we need to run a load test against it. Well, if one of our e-commerce plugins or one of our e-commerce connections is maybe to a payment processor that we're paying maybe 2 cents every call against it, if you guys want to put a number on it like that, well, then throwing 100,000 fake users against that API and the application is going to cost us a lot of money. And to do it in a CI/CD workflow, it's just really it's impossible, right? We're not going to have that capital expenditure just on testing. So what we can do is we can virtualize that API and then feel free to hit our application with that small snippet of virtualized asset. But we can hit that in a CI/CD pipeline without any fear of that dependency costing a lot of money, or us actually bringing down maybe the house by virtualizing a really important database.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I just want to add on, one of the beauties of ReadyAPI and how we designed it very cohesively is that SoapUI Pro has a load test runner that is very similar to SoapUI. So if you're currently a SoapUI Pro user and you've integrated that into a workflow, creating load tests is very easy within the tool, and then you can just use the load test runner to start, you know, building that into a Jenkins pipeline. As Mike is showing here, very similar to how it is in Test Runner. So designed in the same vein makes it a lot easier to really bring those two together.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And I think this is going to be our last question here. If you feel I didn't get to you, I will probably get back to you personally. We have one though here. Can you go to non-GUI mode? Is there scripting? So can we script in SoapUI?
Yeah, absolutely. So everything that we can do, or most things that we can do within ReadyAPI, we can execute headlessly. So there's going to be a little bit of manual setup creating these tests, which is always just good practice because you want to be able to really see and control at granular level how you're testing and especially what you're testing. But once that's set up, you're going to be running this a couple times. A quick sanity check is what I always recommend. And then move that to that headless environment. So you can execute these tests from the command line, you can execute them from Jenkins or another CI/CD tool, but there is not always that dependency on the GUI.
All right, perfect. Guys, I just want to thank you for joining us today, giving us an awesome demo, walking us through that. And then thanks to all the attendees. Hopefully you got some great knowledge today out of us. We will answer some of these questions back on the poll and be sure to send out the recording as soon as we have it cleaned up a little bit. But good luck in getting Jenkins and API testing up and running, and everyone have a good rest of your week.
Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.